It's 3 a.m., and your eyes just opened on their own. No alarm, no noise. You're just suddenly fully awake, staring at the ceiling, and your first thought is that something is wrong with you. Maybe stress. Maybe too much screen time before bed. Maybe your body is broken in some quiet, specific way that only shows up in the dark. But the real answer is far stranger than anything wrong with you tonight. For most of human history, that exact moment wasn't a malfunction. It was the plan. You've probably heard the term segmented sleep before, usually attached to the historian who supposedly discovered it, Roger E. Kirch, and usually described as some quirky medieval habit that vanished once candles got better. That story is true, but it's incomplete, and the missing part goes back a lot further than a European castle. The Greek historian Thucydides used the phrase after first sleep while describing a military campaign, and he wasn't inventing the concept, he was assuming his readers already understood it. The Romans had an entire vocabulary built around it. Primus somnus, prima nox, concubia nox. Military writers like Julius Caesar and Livy used these terms constantly, timing nighttime ambushes around the exact hour when soldiers would naturally wake between their first and second stretch of sleep. So the medieval discovery wasn't a discovery at all. It was a habit so old that by the time medieval Europe was doing it, humans had already been doing it for well over 1,000 years. So what actually happened during that gap between sleeps? Not tossing, not turning, not scrolling a phone in the dark. Europeans had a name for this state too, and it wasn't English, it was French. Dorveil. A blend of the words for sleep and waking, describing a hazy, dreamlike in-between consciousness that people treated as its own distinct mental state, not just an inconvenient gap. Think of it less like insomnia and more like a recognized, almost meditative pause built into the architecture of the night. People used it to pray, to think, to talk quietly with a partner in bed. And in one strange surviving document, a 16th century French doctor's manual, that pause was recommended as the optimal window for something else entirely. The manual advised couples that the best time to conceive a child wasn't at the start of the night, but after the first sleep, claiming people have more enjoyment and simply do it better during that midnight interval. A medical professional writing this down as practical advice 400 years before anyone coined the phrase sleep hygiene. Here's where it gets genuinely surprising, though. This didn't disappear the moment gas lamps and electric bulbs showed up. It faded so gradually that people forgot they were forgetting it. In 1911, an American newspaper ran an advice column telling insomniacs to try splitting their night into 2 separate sleep periods. The columnist wrote about it like a fresh idea, a clever trick, something readers had never considered. In reality, that trick had been the default setting for the human species for most of its existence, and it had only just quietly slipped out of memory, and it didn't vanish everywhere at the same pace. Segmented sleep survived into living memory among some indigenous communities in Nigeria, in parts of Central America, and in Brazil, well into the 20th century, long after most of the industrialized world had already forgotten the word for it. So the modern story usually stops right there. Ancient humans, closer to nature, slept in 2 peaceful shifts, undisturbed by artificial light, resting deeply and waking gently. It's a clean story. It's also, according to one of the most important sleep studies of the last decade, mostly wrong. A UCLA researcher named Jerome Siegel wanted to test that assumption directly, so instead of theorizing about ancient sleep, he went and studied people living about as close to it as anyone alive today. 3 groups. The Hadza in Tanzania, the San in Namibia, the Tsimane in Bolivia. 0 electricity, 0 artificial light pollution, as close to a pre-industrial nightly rhythm as modern science can responsibly observe. And the results didn't support the fantasy of blissful, unbroken rest. Average sleep time across all 3 groups landed between just 5.7 and 7.1 hours a night, which sits at the low end of what's typically reported in electrified, industrialized societies. In other words, the humans living the closest thing to an ancestral lifestyle were not outsleeping you. If anything, some nights they were sleeping less. Does that mean their sleep was worse? This is the part that should genuinely stop you. 2 of these 3 groups, the San and the Tsimane, don't have a word for insomnia. Not because it's taboo to mention, because the condition is so rare among them that language never needed to build a slot for it. Researchers working with these communities have described actual difficulty explaining the concept at all, trying to describe a disorder that essentially doesn't register as a lived experience for these populations. Fewer hours of sleep, and almost none of the anxious, fragmented relationship with sleep that defines so many nights in the industrialized world. So if it isn't hours that separate you from them, what is it? Part of the answer is what actually wakes people up in the first place. It's tempting to assume ancient humans were creatures of the sun, drifting off at dusk and rising with the first light. But the data says otherwise. Across all three groups Siegel studied, people consistently woke up not at sunrise, but at the coldest point of the entire 24-hour cycle, the hour just before dawn when ambient temperature bottoms out. Not light, temperature. It suggests the oldest biological alarm clock built into the human body may not be your eyes detecting brightness at all, but your skin and core temperature detecting cold, a system running quietly underneath the more obvious one you're used to blaming for your grogginess. And there's a second signal, even stranger, that seems to survive electricity almost entirely intact. In 2021, researchers tracked two very different groups, the Tobacom communities in Argentina and college students in Seattle, and found something odd tucked inside the lunar calendar. Total nightly sleep swung by roughly 46 to 58 minutes over the course of a single lunar cycle. People went to bed later and slept measurably less in the nights leading up to a full moon. This effect was strongest in the community with the least access to artificial light, exactly what you'd expect. But it was still measurable in the college students, sleeping under electric bulbs with blackout curtains, phones charging beside their beds, no meaningful exposure to actual moonlight at all. Something in human physiology appears to still be quietly listening to a rhythm most people haven't consciously tracked since before streetlights existed. So here's the reframe worth sitting with. Ancient humans didn't sleep longer than you. They didn't sleep more peacefully than you, at least not by the numbers. What they seem to have had wasn't quantity. It was a nervous system that hadn't yet been asked to override cold, moonlight, and the natural pause of Dorvey with a phone screen and a 9-to-5 alarm. And zooming out even further makes the picture stranger still. Compare humans to every other primate on the planet, and something doesn't add up. Humans sleep less than any other primate studied, full stop, and yet spend the highest proportion of that shortened sleep in REM, the deep, dream-heavy stage where the brain does its most intensive processing. Researchers like David Sampson argue this trade happened for a reason. Once early ancestors came down out of the trees and started sleeping on the ground, exposed to predators and surrounded by a more complex social world, long, unguarded stretches of sleep became a liability instead of a luxury. So the body appears to have made a trade. Less total sleep, but denser, more efficient sleep. Freeing up more waking hours for tool use, for cooperation, for exactly the kind of social bonding that eventually built everything you now call civilization. Which brings this back to you, at 3 a.m., staring at a ceiling, assuming something is broken. It probably isn't. That gap you wake into might be Dorvale, arriving 1,000 years later than the word for it, and centuries after anyone remembered its name. Your body clock might be listening less to the sun than to a temperature drop your ancestors' bodies were built to notice first. And somewhere in your physiology, even under artificial light, something might still be quietly counting the phases of a moon you never look up to check. That 3 a.m. moment was never a malfunction. It was never broken sleep waiting to be fixed. It's the oldest rhythm you have, still running, patiently, underneath every alarm clock you've ever set.